Welcome to lecture number 52. Today we're talking about labor in the Gilded Age, and our theme is work, exchange, and technology. So last week we talked about the industrial leaders during the Gilded Age, and today we're going to be talking about those who were in the actual factories, those who were working for these industrial leaders. We have one learning objective. It is explain the socioeconomic continuities and changes associated with the growth of industrial capitalism from 1865 to 1898. So we're looking at the labor side today. And to begin, we have the price of many goods decreased, workers' real wages increased, providing new access to a variety of goods and services. Many American standards of living improved, while the gap between the rich and the poor grew. So up to this point, we have painted a pretty grim picture for the workers during the Gilded Age. But the reality was that their wages and their spending power increased throughout the entire Gilded Age because of the economic expansion that was going on. So the price of goods is going to decrease. That's due to greater consolidation from the large businesses, greater amounts of transportation that makes shipping goods faster and cheaper, and the production of goods increases, and so whenever the supply of something is high, the price of it goes down. On the top right, you see a chart here of U.S. economic data, and you see that throughout the late 19th century, the gross national product of the United States continues to grow. From 1869 to 1897, we see almost a tripling of the gross national product. And workers' real wages are also going to increase. Now, the real wage is not exactly the amount of money that a worker is paid. A real wage is the amount of money that someone is paid when taking into consideration the amount of inflation in the economy. So when purchasing power will increase over time, regardless of the nominal wage, if the consumer price index or inflation goes down. The bottom chart is a little bit more complicated, but you can see that starting on the right side here in the 1870s, the real annual earnings, these are dollars that have been adjusted for inflation, are going to at first kind of stay the same, but then when we get into the 1880s, they're going to start going up. So we begin with 375 here in 1870, and we go up to 573 in the year 1900. Now, at the same time, inflation is going down. That means that the money that each person is earning is able to buy a lot more. So the inflation is measured by the consumer price index here on the right side. And so anytime that the number goes below 100, that means that inflation is going down. And you can see that throughout this entire period when the CPI is being measured, it goes from 124 to 84. So urban families are able to earn more, but they still have to have multiple forms of income. The father, the mother, and a lot of the times the child would go out to work to gain income. Now, the standard of living in the cities was pretty poor. It was crowded and it was dirty, and these new types of buildings called dumbbell tenements were created in order to fit more people in a limited amount of space. At first, these tenements were just rectangular in shape, but after some laws inside of the big cities, they were required to have at least one window, and so it created a type of architecture that had a air shaft here in the middle. You can see it in the top left picture. The top right picture is more of the traditional tenement where it's just these rectangular buildings. And the people living inside, as you can see, were very crowded. A lot of times there were 6-7 people to a very small room. This is documented in Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives, in which he gives a verbal account or a written account and also some photographic images of how people in the inner city live. A lot of the times the people who were living in the inner city were immigrants who had just recently come to the United States to work. There is a development of suburbs in this time period, but the people who are living in the suburbs are going to, of course, have more money because they'll be able to commute into the city. The wealth gap continues to grow. The richest 10% control 90% of America's wealth. And people look to these uber rich people like Andrew Carnegie, J.D. Rockefeller, and they look to them for inspiration. During this time, Horatio Alger is writing a series of books on actual people that came to the United States with very little money and made it rich. And so that provides a lot of inspiration for people to continue to work, and hopefully one day they too would become one of these captains of industry. Now, labor and management's battled over wages and working conditions, with workers organizing local and national unions and or directly confronting business leaders. So the notable unions that you need to remember are the National Labor Union, the Knights of Labor, and the American Federation of Labor. And they're going to become prominent in the years listed here. So National Labor Union is going to be prominent until 1877. Then the Knights of Labor takes over until 1886. And then the AFL is still around today. In the 20th century, they joined up with the CIO. So now you might see them as the AFL-CIO. And we'll talk about why each of these diminished in popularity over time. So the tactics of these labor unions was to strike. A strike is when people stop working and they picket outside of the factory or the railroad company or wherever they might be working. They would boycotts, they would have working slowdowns, and the most important one is collective bargaining. This is when all of the workers agree to bargain with management for a wage increase, that everyone would be willing to take the same wage as long as they're able to bargain collectively. As you can see, some of these strikes and tactics are going to get violent. So the notable strikes here are the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This is the first really big one, and it started in the railroad industry, but then it expanded into a lot of different industries. So it was a nationwide strike that covered more industries than just the railroads. Eventually, the president Hayes calls in troops to stop the strike. So that was one of the first instances in which troops are called to stop the strikers and get them back to work. We have the Haymarket Affair in 1886. And it's seen in the bottom left. This started as a May Day parade. So this is a Labor Day parade, essentially, that was organized by the Knights of Labor, but because some anarchists came in and threw bombs at policemen, the Knights of Labor were blamed for it, and so therefore they lost popularity and slowly began to fade, leading the way for the American Federation of Labor to be the next big labor union. We have the Homestead Strike in 1892 at Carnegie Steel Factory, and the Pullman Strike in 1894. Now, in the Homestead Strike in 1892, the manager of that steel plant brought in a private security force called the Pinkertons. In the Pullman Strike in 1894, the government got involved, issued a court injunction to stop the labor strike. So here's the tactics of management. So we have lockout. This was used in the Pullman strike. And this is when management says, okay, you don't want to work because you feel like you're being underpaid, then you don't get to work. And they would literally close and lock the doors to the factory. Industries would also have blacklists in which they would put the names of any labor organizers that they knew of, and so they would not be able to be hired, and so therefore could not organize a new group of workers. Yellow dog contracts were types of contracts that prohibited workers from being able to join a labor union. If they did, then they could contractually lose their job. The Pinkertons were this private security force, and as we mentioned, they were used in the Homestead Strike. And a lot of the times when these private security forces were used, it escalated into more violence and people being killed. Court injunctions, these are issued by a U.S. court, forcing workers to go back to work and to stop the strike. A lot of the times, the reasoning that the courts gave for these injunctions was that the industry that was being picketed or boycotted or during a strike were important towards the national security or the national infrastructure. All right, so the industrial workforce expanded and child labor increased. So we keep going back to the size of the labor force. It increases, industrialization continues, immigrants provide a high supply of workers, and because there's so many workers, it leads to wages being pushed down. So again, the laws of supply and demand at work here. Whenever there is a lot of something, its value will go down. A typical work week for any industrial worker would be about 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. This is the time period in which labor unions are starting to advocate for an 8-hour workday. And finally, 20% of children worked outside of the home by 1900. This was up from 12% in 1870. Reformers in the 1890s are going to view this as a big problem. Lewis Hine was a photographer who worked for an advocacy group that was trying to end child labor. So he went all across the country to document children at work and to put a visual face to all of these kids who had to endure these difficult working conditions. He went to mines, he went to textile mills, to glass blowing factories, and in all of them he was able to find children working. All right, here is a recap. So workers' wages were rising and purchasing power rose. However, economic disparity was still growing. Discontent in labor led to the rise of labor unions, yet at this time, labor unions are still experiencing limited success in this period. Management, with the help of government, is keeping their progress down. Management utilized their own tactics in dealing with unions, and finally, child labor became more common. All right, that is it for this lecture. Thank you for watching. Please come back and watch the next one, in which we begin talking about immigration during the Gilded Age. See you then.